Some mothers would move mountains to save their children. Others would burn down entire towns to avenge them. In the frontier town of Millhaven, Clara Rowe arrives with gold in her saddlebags and fire in her eyes, doubling the price for a young man at auction. The boy swears he's never seen her before, but Clara knows better. She's been searching for 30 years, and now she's found what was taken from her. When people start disappearing and old secrets crawl out of their graves, the town realizes they're caught between a woman's revenge and a truth that could destroy them all. But what happens when the past refuses to stay buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust settled around Clara Rowe's boots as she stood in the center of Millhaven's main street, her weathered leather coat catching the late afternoon sun. The town sprawled before her like a collection of forgotten promises, weathered storefronts with peeling paint, boardwalks that creaked under the weight of worn boots, and windows that reflected more secrets than light. This place had aged poorly, she thought, like guilt left to fester in the desert heat. She adjusted the heavy pouch at her hip, feeling the weight of 30 years' worth of saved coins. Each piece of silver and gold represented a day of labor, a night of planning, a moment of hope that she would find what had been stolen from her. The leather was soft now from countless touches, worn smooth by nervous fingers during sleepless nights when the memories became too heavy to bear alone. Thomas McCarthy worked in the stables at the far end of town, his movements careful and precise as he brushed down a chestnut mare. At 23, he possessed an earnest quality that made the older women in town want to mother him and the younger ones to marry him. His sandy brown hair caught the light streaming through the stable doors, and when he smiled, which was often, despite his circumstances, dimples appeared at the corners of his mouth that would have reminded Clara of someone else entirely. If she allowed herself to look too closely, he wore a simple wooden cross around his neck, hand-carved with careful attention to detail. The wood had darkened with age and wear, and the leather cord showed signs of having been retied multiple times. Clara had noticed it immediately during the auction, her breath catching in her throat as recognition hit her like a physical blow. She knew that cross. She had carved it herself during the long winter months when her belly was round with promise, and her hands needed something to do besides count the days until spring. The boy, she still thought of him as a boy, though he was fully grown now, hummed quietly as he worked, a melody that seemed to come from some deep, forgotten place. It was a lullaby she had sung to him during those precious few months when he was hers completely, when the world made sense and the future held nothing but possibility. He didn't know he remembered it, of course. How could he? He had been barely walking when they took him. Clara positioned herself across the street from the stables, settling onto a bench outside the general store where she could observe without drawing attention. The shopkeeper, a thin man with nervous eyes named Holloway, had already marked her as trouble. She could see it in the way he watched her through his window, probably calculating how much gold she carried and whether it was worth the risk of getting involved in whatever she was planning. "You planning on sitting there all day?" Holloway finally emerged from his store, wiping his hands on a stained apron. His voice carried the particular wariness that frontier merchants developed when strangers lingered too long near their property. "Just resting," Clara replied without turning to look at him. Her voice was steady, with the kind of calm that came from having nothing left to lose. "Nice town you have here, peaceful," Holloway snorted. "Peaceful enough, I suppose, though we don't get many visitors carrying that kind of weight." He nodded toward her saddlebags, which she had positioned carefully beside the bench. "Especially not women traveling alone." Clara finally turned to study him, her grey eyes taking in the nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his fingers worked the fabric of his apron. "I imagine there's a lot of things this town doesn't usually get. But then again, small places like this tend to hold on to their secrets, don't they?" Something flickered across Holloway's face, a shadow of old fear, perhaps, or recognition. He stepped back toward his store, suddenly eager to end the conversation. "Well, you'll find rooms at the Copper Bell, if you're staying the night. Martha Henley runs a clean establishment." Clara nodded her thanks, but made no move to leave her position. Across the street, Thomas had emerged from the stables and was heading toward the town well, a wooden bucket in each hand. She watched the easy way he moved, the unconscious grace that reminded her so much of his father. The resemblance was there in the set of his shoulders, the length of his stride, the way he paused to help an elderly woman struggling with her own water bucket. Dr. Samuel Winters approached from the direction of his small clinic, his black bag in hand and his expression thoughtful. He was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen too much suffering to judge anyone harshly. Clara had already marked him as someone who might be trusted, if trust became necessary. "Afternoon," he said, tipping his hat as he passed her bench. "You're the woman from the auction yesterday?" "I am." He paused, studying her face with the careful attention of someone accustomed to reading pain in others. "That was quite generous of you, what you did for the boy. Though I have to say it's caused quite a stir among the locals." Clara's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, a subtle straightening that suggested she was fully prepared for whatever conversation might follow. "People talk. It's what they do in small towns." "Indeed they do." Dr. Winters set down his bag and settled onto the other end of the bench, uninvited, but not unwelcome. "Thomas is a good young man, been working hard since he came to town a few years back. Never caused any trouble, never asked for anything he didn't earn. And before he came to town—" The doctor's pause was slight, but Clara caught it. "He was raised by the Hendersons over in Copper Creek, good Christian folks, though they've both passed now. Thomas came here looking for work after their farm failed." Clara nodded slowly, filing away the information. "Must have been difficult for him, losing the only family he knew." "I imagine so. Though if you're thinking of offering him some kind of charity—" "I'm not in the business of charity, Doctor." Clara's voice carried a finality that ended that line of conversation. "But I appreciate your concern for his well-being." Sheriff Morrison emerged from his office down the street, his star catching the sunlight as he surveyed his domain. He was a big man, running to fat now, but still carrying the authority of his position with practiced ease. His eyes found Clara immediately, and she saw recognition there, not of her specifically, but of the type of trouble she represented. Strangers with gold and secrets rarely brought anything good to quiet towns. Thomas had finished his tasks and was walking back toward the rooming house where he stayed, his day's wages clutched in his hand. Clara watched him count the coins carefully, saw him smile at whatever small sum he had earned. It was the smile of someone who had learned to find joy in simple things, who had never expected life to offer him more than honest work and a roof over his head. The wooden cross caught the light again as he moved, and Clara's hand unconsciously went to her own throat, where a matching chain had once hung. She had thrown it away the night they took him, unable to bear the weight of faith in a world that would steal a child from his mother's arms. But seeing it now, worn and treasured around his neck, she felt something crack open inside her chest, a place that had been sealed shut for 3 decades. As the sun began to set, painting the dusty street in shades of gold and amber, Clara finally rose from her bench. She had seen enough for one day. Tomorrow she would begin the real work of uncovering what had happened to her son and why he had ended up in this forgotten corner of nowhere, carrying a cross he couldn't remember receiving and humming lullabies he shouldn't know. The abandoned homestead she had chosen for her camp lay 3 miles outside town, hidden among a grove of cottonwood trees that provided both shelter and concealment. It had belonged to a family named Morrison, no relation to the sheriff, according to the land records she had studied before coming here. The original owners had died in a fever epidemic 20 years back, and the property had reverted to the territorial government. No one bothered to maintain it, which made it perfect for her purposes. Clara unpacked her supplies with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years living rough. A bedroll, carefully waterproofed and patched where necessary, cooking supplies that folded flat and nested together to save space, a rifle that had seen better days but still shot true, and wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, the personal items that had sustained her through 30 years of searching, a lock of baby-fine hair, a tiny moccasin, and the photograph that had started everything. The photograph was sepia-toned and cracked at the edges, showing a young woman holding an infant. Clara could barely recognize herself in that girl's face, so full of hope and certainty about what the future held. The baby in her arms wore a simple white gown she had sewn herself, and around his neck was the wooden cross she had carved during the long winter months of her pregnancy. It was the only proof she had that Thomas McCarthy had once been someone else entirely, someone who belonged to her. As darkness settled over the homestead, Clara built a small fire and set water to boil for coffee. The familiar rituals helped calm her mind and organize her thoughts. Tomorrow she would begin asking the questions that needed to be asked, and she suspected the answers would be neither simple nor pleasant. But tonight, she allowed herself to sit by the fire and remember the weight of her son in her arms, the sound of his breathing as he slept, and the dreams she had once harbored of teaching him to ride and hunt and find his place in the world. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild in the desert night. Clara listened until the echoes faded, then banked her fire and prepared for sleep. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight she was closer to her son than she had been in 30 years, and that was enough. Clara waited until the morning bustle had settled before making her approach. Thomas was mucking out the stalls in the stable, his sleeves rolled up against the warming day when her shadow fell across the doorway. He looked up from his work, squinting against the sunlight behind her, and she saw him tense, not with fear exactly, but with the wariness of someone who had learned that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. "Morning," she said, keeping her voice gentle. "Mind if I come in?" Thomas straightened, wiping his hands on a rag tucked into his belt. "Ma'am." He nodded respectfully, but his eyes remained cautious. "If you're looking for the stable master, he won't be back until I'm looking for you." Actually, Clara stepped into the relative coolness of the stable, noting how Thomas instinctively positioned himself near the back exit. "Smart boy. I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday." "Thank me?" Thomas's confusion was genuine. "Ma'am, I think you've got me confused with someone else. I didn't do anything worth thanking." Clara studied his face, searching for any flicker of recognition, any sign that some buried memory might be stirring. Instead, she saw only honest bewilderment and growing discomfort. "The auction," she said quietly. "You were there." "Well, yes, but—" Thomas shook his head, color rising in his cheeks. "Ma'am, I appreciate what you did, truly, but I don't understand why you did it." "We don't know each other." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. Don't know each other? How could he not know her? She had memorized every line of his infant face, had kissed every tiny finger, had whispered promises into his ear during those precious early months. But looking at him now, she saw only polite confusion and the beginnings of alarm. "You're right," she said finally. "We don't know each other." "But I knew your parents." Thomas went very still. "My parents are dead." "I know. I'm sorry for your loss." Clara took a careful step closer, watching his reaction. "But before the Hendersons, before Copper Creek, do you remember anything about your life before then?" "I was just a baby when they took me in." Thomas's voice carried the patient tone of someone who had explained this many times before. "They found me after my birth parents died." "I don't remember anything before the farm." Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. The lie was so complete, so thoroughly integrated into his sense of self, that he believed it without question. "How did your birth parents die?" "Fever. Same one that got half the territory that year." Thomas was moving now, restless and uncomfortable, his hands working the rag without purpose. "Ma'am, I'm not sure why you're asking these questions, but what about that cross you wear?" Thomas's hand went instinctively to his throat, fingers closing around the wooden pendant. What about it? Where did it come from? It was my mother's, Mary Henderson. She gave it to me before she passed. But even as he said it, something flickered across his face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or the ghost of a memory that didn't quite fit. She said it would protect me. Clara reached into her coat and pulled out the faded photograph, her fingers trembling slightly as she held it out to him. Does this look familiar to you? Thomas took the photograph reluctantly, his brow furrowing as he studied the image. Clara watched his face intently, looking for any sign of recognition. For a moment, his expression seemed to soften, as if something deep inside him was stirring. Then he handed the photograph back, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't know who this is. Look at the cross around the baby's neck." Thomas glanced at the photograph again, and this time Clara saw his fingers tighten around his own cross. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same carved details, the same pattern worn into the wood. When he looked up at her, there was something new in his eyes. Fear. "I need to get back to work," he said, backing toward the stable door. "Whatever you think you know about me." "Thomas, wait." But he was already moving, his long strides carrying him quickly away from the stables and toward the main street. Clara followed, calling his name, but he broke into a run, disappearing around the corner of the blacksmith's shop. She stood in the dusty street, holding the photograph that contained the only proof she had of their connection, watching her son flee from the truth of his own identity. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through Millhaven's tight-knit community. By noon, Clara could feel the weight of suspicious glances and whispered conversations following her wherever she went. When she entered the Copper Bell to take a room, the proprietor, a sharp-eyed woman named Martha Henley, greeted her with barely concealed hostility. "Heard you've been bothering that boy," Martha said without preamble, her hands planted firmly on her hips. "Thomas is a good Christian young man, and we don't take kindly to strangers stirring up trouble for our own." "I wasn't trying to cause trouble," Clara replied mildly, though her patience was wearing thin. "I just wanted to talk to him." "About what?" "Some fool notion that you knew his parents. Everyone knows he was an orphan. The Hendersons raised him proper after his folks died in the fever." Clara set her payment on the counter, meeting Martha's hostile stare with calm determination. "And you know this how?" "Because that's how it was. That's how it's always been." Martha's voice carried the finality of someone stating an indisputable fact. "Room's upstairs, second door on the left. Breakfast is at 6, supper at 5. You cause any more trouble for that boy, and you'll find yourself sleeping under the stars." That afternoon brought news that sent a chill through the town. Jake Morrison, no relation to the sheriff despite the name, had failed to return home from his usual fishing trip to the creek. His horse had come back riderless, its reins tangled in the brush, but there was no sign of Jake himself. Search parties had combed the area, but found nothing more than his fishing gear scattered along the creek bank. Clara was sitting on the porch of the Copper Bell when Sheriff Morrison approached, his expression grim and his hand resting casually on his gun belt. He was a man who understood the power of physical presence, and he used it now to maximum effect as he loomed over her chair. "Funny thing," he said without preamble. "Jake Morrison disappears the day after you show. Up in town, asking questions about ancient history." Clara looked up at him with the kind of level gaze that suggested she had faced down more intimidating men than him. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with this man's disappearance, Sheriff?" "I'm suggesting that coincidences make me nervous, especially when they involve strangers with mysterious pasts and heavy purses." Morrison settled into the chair beside her, uninvited. "So why don't you tell me what really brought you to Millhaven?" "Personal business." "What kind of personal business involves harassing young men with wild stories about their parentage?" Clara turned to study him more carefully, noting the way his eyes held hers without flinching, the confidence in his posture that suggested he was used to intimidating people into compliance. "The kind that's none of your concern, Sheriff." Morrison's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Everything that happens in this town is my concern, lady, especially when it involves one of our own." Thomas McCarthy is under my protection now, and if I hear about you approaching him again, you'll what?" Clara's voice remained calm, but something dangerous glittered in her grey eyes. "Arrest me for talking to someone? I'll arrest you for whatever I damn well please if you keep stirring up trouble." Morrison stood, using his height to tower over her again. "This is a peaceful town, and we aim to keep it that way. You'd be wise to remember that." After the sheriff left, Clara sat in the gathering dusk and considered her options. Jake Morrison's disappearance was unfortunate timing, but she couldn't let it derail her mission. She had waited 30 years to find her son. She wouldn't be deterred now by small-town politics and coincidental tragedies. That evening, she made her way to the edge of town, where Thomas rented a small room above the saddle shop. She found him sitting on the wooden steps, staring out at the desert with an expression of deep confusion. When he saw her approaching, he didn't run this time. Instead, he looked up at her with eyes that held a mixture of fear and desperate curiosity. "That photograph," he said without preamble. "The cross in it. It's exactly like mine, isn't it?" Clara sat down beside him, careful to leave enough space so he wouldn't feel trapped. "Yes, but that doesn't mean anything. Lots of people make crosses. It could be coincidence. It could be." Clara kept her voice gentle, non-threatening. "But you felt something when you looked at it, didn't you? Something familiar." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his fingers working the cross around his neck. "Sometimes I have dreams," he said finally, "about a woman singing to me. I can never see her face, but her voice, it's like something I've always known." Clara's throat tightened, but she managed to keep her voice steady. "What does she sing?" Thomas hummed a few notes, the same lullaby Clara had sung to him as an infant, the one she had heard him humming in the stables. The melody hung in the air between them like a bridge across 30 years of separation. "I carved that cross for you before you were born," Clara said quietly. "And I sang you that song every night, until the day they took you away from me." Thomas looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time she saw something other than confusion in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the beginning of possibility. Clara spent the next morning in the territorial courthouse, a cramped building that smelled of dust and old paper. The records she needed were stored in the basement, filed away in boxes that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The clerk, a nervous young man named Peter, who clearly didn't know what to make of her unusual request, hovered nearby as she methodically worked her way through birth certificates, death records, and property transfers from 30 years past. "Not many people interested in records that old," Peter commented, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "What exactly are you looking for?" "Information about a baby who died in the fever epidemic of 1842, Clara replied, without looking up from the ledger she was examining. "His name would have been Michael Rowe." Peter shifted uncomfortably. "That was a terrible time. Lost nearly half the children in the territory that year. Whole families wiped out." Clara found the entry she was looking for and felt her blood run cold. There it was, written in careful script. Michael Rowe, aged 8 months. Died of fever on September 15, 1842, survived by Mother Clara Rowe of Pine Ridge. But she knew with absolute certainty that her son had not died of fever. He had been taken from her arms by men who claimed they were protecting him from a mother who couldn't provide proper care. The death certificate was a lie, carefully crafted to erase any trace of what had really happened. "Strange thing about that particular year," Peter continued, apparently unaware of the significance of what Clara had just discovered. "We had more child deaths recorded than any year before or since, but also more adoptions. Like God was taking with one hand and giving with the other." Clara looked up sharply. "Adoptions? Oh yes. Lots of families took in children who lost their parents. The Hendersons over in Copper Creek adopted several over the years. Good Christian folks they were, always willing to help orphaned children find homes." The pieces began falling into place in Clara's mind with sickening clarity. The Hendersons hadn't just taken in orphaned children. They had been part of a system that created orphans by stealing children from parents deemed unfit. Her son's death certificate was proof of a conspiracy that had robbed her of 30 years with him. She spent the rest of the morning copying relevant records, focusing on the period around her son's supposed death. The pattern became clearer with each document she examined. Children reported as fever victims, followed by adoption records for the same age group. Property transfers that stripped land from grieving families. A systematic operation designed to separate children from parents while enriching those in positions of authority. When Clara returned to town, she found Thomas waiting for her outside the Copper Bell, his face pale and drawn. He had clearly spent a sleepless night wrestling with the implications of their conversation, and the internal struggle showed in every line of his body. "I remembered something," he said, without preamble. "About the night Mary Henderson died. She was delirious from the fever, talking about things that didn't make sense. She kept apologizing to someone named Clara, saying she was sorry for what they had done." His eyes met hers, searching for answers. "That's your name, isn't it?" Clara felt her heart clench, but she kept her voice steady. "Yes," she said. She tried to stop them, but it was too late. That the boy, that I, would never know the truth. Thomas's hands were shaking now, his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around him. "What truth? What did they do?" Clara pulled the child's torn shirt from her saddlebag, the blood-stained fabric she had preserved for 30 years, as evidence of the violence that had torn her family apart. The sight of it made Thomas step backward, his face going white. "They came for you in the middle of the night," Clara said quietly. "3 men with official papers claiming you were in danger from an unfit mother. When I tried to stop them, they—" She touched the fabric gently, remembering the feel of her son's blood on her hands. "You fought them, even as small as you were. This is from the shirt you were wearing when they dragged you away from me." Thomas stared at the fabric, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not. I was orphaned. My parents died. The Hendersons saved me." "The Hendersons were part of it," Clara said. "They took stolen children and raised them as their own, probably believing they were doing God's work. But you weren't orphaned, Thomas. You were kidnapped." The sound that came from Thomas was somewhere between a sob and a growl. He turned away from her, his hands clutching at his hair as if he could physically hold his fragmenting reality together. "This is insane. You're insane. People don't just steal children and pretend they're dead. They do when there's profit in it," Clara said grimly. "And when the people in charge are willing to look the other way." That afternoon brought news of another disappearance. Councilmember Henry Walsh had failed to return from a business trip to the neighboring town of Cedar Falls. His wagon had been found overturned on the road, but there was no sign of Walsh himself. 2 disappearances in 2 days had the town buzzing with nervous energy and suspicious glances. Clara found herself once again facing Sheriff Morrison, this time in his office, where the walls were lined with wanted posters and the air thick with the smell of tobacco and old leather. 2 men vanish in 2 days. "Both of them upstanding members of this community," Morrison said, his voice deceptively casual. "And both disappearances happen after you arrive in town with your wild stories and heavy purse. Coincidences happen, Sheriff? Not in my experience." "And they don't." Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with shrewd eyes. "I've been asking around about you, Clara Rowe. Interesting thing is, nobody seems to remember you from Pine Ridge, almost like you never existed." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had expected this. The systematic erasure of inconvenient people was part of how these operations worked. "Maybe you're asking the wrong people. Or maybe you're not who you claim to be." Morrison stood and walked to the window, looking out at his domain with the satisfaction of a man who controlled everything within his view. "See, the thing about small communities is that people remember. They remember faces, names, stories, but nobody remembers a Clara Rowe who lost a child 30 years ago. Then their memories are conveniently short." Morrison turned back to her, his expression hardening. "Or your story is conveniently false. Either way, I'm keeping a close eye on you. Any more of my citizens disappear, and I'll be having a very different conversation with you." That evening, Clara sat in her room at the Copper Bell, organizing the evidence she had gathered. The death certificate, The adoption records, the blood-stained shirt, each piece told part of a story that stretched back 3 decades. But she needed more than historical documents to prove what had happened to her son. She needed living witnesses, people who had been there when the conspiracy was carried out. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Dr. Winters standing in the hallway, his expression grave, and his black bag in his hand. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. "We need to talk." Clara stepped aside to let him enter. Noting the way, he carefully closed the door behind him and checked to make sure they couldn't be overheard. "I treated both Jake Morrison and Henry Walsh over the years," he said without preamble. "They were both present at births that resulted in infant deaths during the fever epidemic." "Quite a few births, actually." Clara felt her pulse quicken. "What are you saying, Doctor?" "I'm saying that some of those babies didn't die of fever," Dr. Winters replied grimly. "And I'm saying that you might not be the only person in town with reasons to want certain secrets to stay buried." Dr. Winters moved to the window and peered through the curtains before turning back to Clara, his face etched with the weight of long-held secrets. "There's something you need to see," he said, reaching into his medical bag. "I've been carrying this for 30 years, waiting for someone who might understand its significance." He pulled out a partially burned document, its edges charred and the text barely legible. Clara took it carefully, her trained eyes working to decipher the faded ink. It was a property deed, but not just any deed. This was for land that included the entire valley where Millhaven now stood, and the original owner's name was listed as Clara Rowe. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her hands trembling as she held the proof that she had once owned the very ground beneath their feet. "From the fire that destroyed the Territorial Land Office 30 years ago," Dr. Winters replied grimly. "Everyone assumed it was an accident, but I was treating burn victims that night. One of them pressed this into my hands before he died, told me to keep it safe because people had been murdered for what it contained." Clara studied the document more carefully, noting the signatures of witnesses and the official seal that had been partially destroyed by the flames. The implications were staggering. If this deed was authentic, then her son's kidnapping hadn't just been about stealing a child. It had been about stealing an inheritance worth a fortune. "The land was valuable even then," Dr. Winters continued. "Rich soil, good water rights, perfect for cattle ranching. But your husband's death left you vulnerable. And a single woman with a baby was an easy target for men who wanted what you had." Thomas appeared at Clara's door an hour later, his face haggard from another sleepless night, filled with fragmenting memories and dawning realizations. When he saw the burned deed spread across her table, his eyes widened with recognition he couldn't quite place. "I've seen that before," he said slowly, moving closer to examine the document. "In dreams, maybe, or—" He stopped, his hand going to his temple as if trying to catch an elusive thought. "There was a man who used to come to the Henderson farm. He had papers like this, official-looking things with seals and signatures. Mary would get upset whenever he visited, send me to my room so I couldn't hear what they discussed." Clara felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Do you remember what this man looked like?" "Tall, with graying hair and a star on his chest." Thomas's eyes met hers, fear and understanding warring in his expression. "It was Sheriff Morrison, wasn't it? He's been part of this from the beginning." The third disappearance occurred that very night. Banker Edmund Hartwell vanished from his home, leaving behind only an overturned chair and an open safe. His wife reported that he had been agitated for days, talking about old debts coming due and mistakes that could no longer be hidden. The pattern was becoming clear. Someone was systematically eliminating people who had knowledge of the conspiracy that had robbed Clara of her son and her inheritance. Clara found Thomas at the abandoned church on the outskirts of town, a small wooden structure that had been damaged by lightning and never repaired. He was sitting in one of the broken pews, staring at the ruined altar where dusty sunbeams filtered through holes in the roof. "I keep having flashes," he said when she sat down beside him. "Memories that don't fit with what I've always believed about myself." A woman's voice singing, hands that felt different from Mary Henderson's, smaller, softer, and fear. So much fear. Clara reached into her coat and pulled out the locket Dr. Winters had given her that morning, a delicate gold piece she had thought lost forever. Inside was a curl of baby-fine hair, still golden after all these years. "I cut this from your head the night before they took you," she said quietly. "It was all I had left of you after they declared you dead." Thomas took the locket with shaking hands, holding it up to catch the light streaming through the damaged roof. The hair inside was an exact match for his own, the evidence undeniable even to his fractured memories. "My God," he whispered, "it's really true, isn't it? Everything I thought I knew about myself is a lie." "Not everything," Clara said gently. "You're still the good man Mary Henderson raised you to be. She may have been part of the deception, but I believe she came to love you as her own son. The guilt she carried about what happened, that was real." Thomas closed the locket carefully, his fingers tracing its worn surface. "How do I live with this knowledge? How do I reconcile the life I've lived with the truth of where I came from?" "One day at a time," Clara replied. "The same way I've lived for 30 years, knowing my child was somewhere in the world but unable to find him." That afternoon, Sheriff Morrison came looking for them both. He found them at Dr. Winter's clinic, where the doctor was examining Thomas for any physical evidence of his early trauma. Morrison's entrance was loud and aggressive, his hand resting on his gun as he surveyed the scene. "This has gone far enough," he announced, his voice filling the small examination room. "Thomas, you're coming with me. And you," he pointed at Clara, "are leaving town today." "On what authority?" Dr. Winters demanded, positioning himself between Morrison and his patients. "On the authority of keeping the peace in my town." Morrison's eyes were hard, calculating. 3 men have disappeared, and the only common thread is her." He jerked his chin toward Clara. "Either she's responsible, or her presence is causing someone else to clean house. Either way, she goes." Thomas stood slowly, his newfound understanding giving him a strength he hadn't possessed before. "I'm not going anywhere with you, Sheriff. Not until I know the truth about what happened to my family, your family." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Boy, your family is dead and buried. Has been for 30 years. Whatever lies this woman has been filling your head with, are they lies?" Thomas interrupted, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Or are you afraid of what I might remember if I keep listening to her?" Morrison's face darkened, and Clara saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. This was a man who had built his life and authority on maintaining certain secrets, and those secrets were now in danger of exposure. He was reaching the point where desperate measures might seem like the only option. "You don't know what you're meddling with," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying a threat that made the air in the room feel thick and dangerous. "Some things are better left buried." "Not this thing," Clara replied, rising to face him. "Not my son." The confrontation was interrupted by Martha Henley, bursting through the clinic door, her face flushed with exertion and fear. "Sheriff, you need to come quick. Someone broke into the Territorial Records office last night. Files are scattered everywhere, and some of the older documents are missing." Morrison's expression shifted from anger to alarm. "Which documents?" "Birth certificates, death records, property deeds, everything from around 30 years ago." Martha's eyes flicked nervously between Clara and the sheriff. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for. Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Someone else was moving pieces on this chessboard. Someone who understood the full scope of what had happened 3 decades ago and was now working to eliminate evidence and witnesses. As Morrison hurried out with Martha to investigate the break-in, Dr. Winters closed and locked his clinic door behind them. "We need to be very careful now," he said grimly. "Someone is escalating this situation, and I don't think they're planning to leave any loose ends." Thomas sank back into his chair, overwhelmed by the rapid pace of revelations and danger. "I feel like I'm caught in a nightmare that I can't wake up from." "You are," Clara said, moving to stand beside him. "But nightmares end when you face what's frightening you. And you're not facing this alone." Outside the clinic windows, the streets of Millhaven seemed different now. less like a sleepy frontier town and more like a place where dangerous secrets had been festering for decades. Clara realized that finding her son had been only the beginning. Now she had to keep him alive long enough to reclaim the life and inheritance that had been stolen from both of them. The hidden cellar beneath the old Morrison homestead, the one Clara had been using for shelter, revealed its secrets slowly, like a wound opening to expose infection beneath. Clara had noticed the loose floorboards her second night there, but it wasn't until Thomas joined her in searching the property that they discovered what lay beneath. The wooden ladder creaked ominously as they descended into the darkness, Clara holding a lantern while Thomas followed close behind. The cellar was larger than expected, carved deep into the earth and reinforced with timber that spoke of permanent construction rather than simple storage. But it was what filled the space that made Clara's blood run cold. Boxes lined the walls, each one carefully labeled with dates spanning 3 decades. Inside were documents that told the story of a systematic operation designed to steal children from families deemed unfit and redistribute them to families willing to pay for the privilege of parenthood. Birth certificates, death certificates, adoption papers, all the bureaucratic machinery needed to erase one identity and create another. "Look at this," Thomas said, his voice tight with horror. He held up a ledger that recorded financial transactions, payments made to officials for falsified documents, fees charged to adoptive families, profits distributed among the conspirators. They were selling children, selling them like livestock. Clara found her own name in multiple entries, along with notations that made her sick to read. "Unfit mother," one entry noted. "Lives alone, no male protection. Child would benefit from stable Christian home." Another entry recorded the payment made to Sheriff Morrison for processing the false death certificate, $50, a small fortune at the time, but it was the final box that contained the most damning evidence. Thomas opened it to find a collection of personal items, toys, clothing, and jewelry that had belonged to the stolen children. Clara recognized her son's tiny moccasins immediately, the ones she had sewn from deerhide during her pregnancy. Beside them lay a child's shirt, identical to the blood-stained one she had preserved. But this one was clean and carefully folded. "They kept trophies," Clara whispered, her voice breaking with rage and grief. "They stole our children and kept pieces of their lives like souvenirs." Thomas held up a small wooden horse, crudely carved but obviously made with love. "I remember this," he said wonderingly. "Someone gave it to me when I was very small. I played with it until Mary Henderson took it away, said it was too rough for a proper Christian boy." His fingers traced the worn edges, and Clara could see memories surfacing in his eyes, fragments of a life before the lies took hold. The sound of footsteps above froze them both. Clara extinguished the lantern immediately, plunging them into complete darkness as someone moved through the house above their heads. The footsteps were deliberate, searching, accompanied by the sound of furniture being overturned and drawers being rifled through. Clara drew her revolver and motioned for Thomas to stay close as they climbed back up the ladder. Through the gaps in the floorboards, they could see a tall figure silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through the broken windows. The intruder wore a star on his chest and moved with the confidence of someone who believed he owned everything within sight. "Sheriff." Morrison was searching her belongings with the systematic thoroughness of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. Clara watched him examine her saddlebags, checking every pocket and compartment before moving on to her bedroll and supplies. When he found the copies she had made of the courthouse records, his cursing was creative and heartfelt. "Damn woman's been busy," Morrison muttered to himself, stuffing the papers into his coat. "Should have run her out of town the first day she showed up with her questions and her gold." Thomas started to move, but Clara grabbed his arm, holding him still. This wasn't the time for confrontation, not when they were trapped in a cellar with only one exit and Morrison was armed and desperate. They needed to wait, to let him finish his search and leave before making their own escape. Morrison found the blood-stained shirt next, holding it up to the moonlight with an expression of grim recognition. "Thought we destroyed all of this?" he said to himself. Should have known she'd keep evidence. Women like her always keep evidence. He bundled the shirt with the other documents and headed toward the door, but paused at the threshold as if sensing he was being watched. For a terrifying moment, Clara thought he might have detected their presence in the cellar. But after a long, tense silence, he continued outside, his footsteps fading as he mounted his horse and rode back toward town. Clara and Thomas waited another hour before emerging from their hiding place, both of them shaken by how close they had come to discovery. The loss of the documents was a serious blow, but the evidence they had found in the cellar more than compensated for what Morrison had taken. We need to get this information to someone in authority, Thomas said, gesturing to the boxes of evidence surrounding them. The territorial marshal, maybe, or a federal judge. Clara shook her head grimly. The territorial marshal is Morrison's drinking buddy. They served together in the war, and Morrison's been feeding him lies about this situation for 30 years. And any federal judge would want to see documentation that Morrison just stole from us. Then what do we do? Clara was quiet for a long moment, studying the evidence of systematic corruption that surrounded them. We do what I came here to do, she said finally. We get justice for what was taken from us, but we do it on our terms, not theirs. The next morning brought news that sent shockwaves through Millhaven. Dr. Winters had been found dead in his clinic, apparently the victim of a robbery gone wrong. His medical bag was missing, along with several bottles of medicine, but neighbors reported hearing no sounds of struggle. The doctor who had spent his life helping others had died quietly in the night, taking his secrets to the grave. Clara felt the loss like a physical blow. Dr. Winters had been the only person in town willing to help them uncover the truth. And now he was gone. But his death also confirmed what she had begun to suspect. Someone was systematically eliminating everyone who knew about the conspiracy that had stolen her son. 4 people in a week. Thomas said quietly as they stood outside the clinic where Dr. Winters' body had been discovered. All of them connected to what happened 30 years ago. Not all of them, Clara replied, her voice hard with determination. The person responsible is still alive and still trying to cover his tracks. But he made a mistake killing Dr. Winters. Now I know for certain who we're dealing with. Thomas looked at her sharply. Morrison? Morrison's just a tool, Clara said. Someone else has been giving the orders all along. Someone with enough power and influence to orchestrate a 30-year cover-up. She turned to face her son, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. But whoever it is, they're about to learn that some mothers will never stop fighting for their children. The blood-stained knife lay wrapped in oiled cloth at the bottom of Martha Henley's hope chest, hidden beneath layers of quilts and winter clothes that hadn't seen daylight in years. Clara discovered it during her methodical search of the boarding house while Martha was at Dr. Winters' funeral, a service that had drawn most of the town despite the mysterious circumstances of his death. The blade was old but well maintained, its edge still sharp enough to cut. More importantly, the dark stains along its length told a story that Clara recognized with sickening clarity. This was the weapon that had cut her son's shirt 30 years ago, the knife that had drawn his blood when he fought against the men who dragged him from her arms. Thomas stood guard at the boarding house window, watching for Martha's return, while Clara examined their grim discovery. "Why would she keep it?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "If she was part of what happened to me, why keep evidence that could destroy her?" "Insurance," Clara replied grimly, wrapping the knife carefully in her own cloth. "People like Martha Henley understand that loyalty only goes so far. When powerful men ask you to do terrible things, you keep proof of what you've done in case you need to negotiate later." The funeral procession was returning from the cemetery, a somber line of black-clad figures making their way back toward town. Clara and Thomas slipped out the back of the boarding house and returned to their hideout in the abandoned homestead, carrying with them the most concrete evidence they had yet found of the violence that had torn their family apart. That afternoon, Thomas experienced his first full memory of the night he was taken. It came without warning as he sat examining the knife that had wounded him. His consciousness suddenly flooded with images and sensations he had buried for 3 decades. He saw Clara's face, younger and desperate, as she fought to protect him from the men who had invaded their home. He remembered the weight of her arms around him, the sound of her voice promising that everything would be all right, even as rough hands pulled him away from her. Most clearly, he remembered Sheriff Morrison, younger then, but unmistakably the same man. Holding the very knife they had just discovered. "He cut me to make me let go of you," Thomas said, his voice hollow with the horror of recovered memory. "I was clinging to your dress, screaming, and he cut my arm to make me release my grip." Clara felt rage build in her chest like a physical pressure, threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained control. For 30 years, she had imagined what that night must have been like for her terrified child. But hearing it described in his own words made it real in a way that memory alone could not. "There were 3 of them," Thomas continued, his eyes distant as he relived the traumatic scene. "Morrison, a man with a thick beard who smelled like tobacco, and someone else who stayed in the shadows. The bearded man kept apologizing to you, saying it was for the best that the boy would have a better life with proper Christian parents. That was Henderson," Clara said quietly. "Thomas Henderson, Mary's husband. He came to our house twice before that night, trying to convince me to give you up voluntarily. Said a woman alone couldn't provide proper guidance for a growing boy. The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place with devastating clarity. The Hendersons hadn't been innocent adoptive parents who happened to receive a stolen child. They had been active participants in the kidnapping, working with Morrison to identify targets and justify their actions as Christian charity. "What about the 3rd man?" Clara asked. "The one who stayed in the shadows?" Thomas frowned, his recovered memories fragmentary and incomplete. "I never saw his face clearly. But he was the one giving orders. Morrison and Henderson deferred to him, called him Sir, and waited for his instructions." He paused, struggling to grasp an elusive detail. "There was something on his chest. A badge or pin of some kind, but different from Morrison's star." Clara felt a chill of recognition. A territorial official, perhaps, or someone from the federal government with authority over local law enforcement. The conspiracy hadn't been a local operation after all. It had federal backing, which explained how it had operated with impunity for so long. That evening, as they prepared for another night at the abandoned homestead, Thomas made a decision that surprised Clara with its quiet determination. "I want to confront Morrison directly," he said, checking the loads in his revolver with practiced ease. "No more hiding, no more gathering evidence. I want to look him in the eye and make him tell me who ordered him to steal me from you." "That's exactly what he wants," Clara warned. "He's been trying to force a confrontation since the day I arrived in town. If we meet him on his terms, in his territory, with his backup, then we don't meet him on his terms." Thomas's voice carried a new quality, a hardness that reminded Clara uncomfortably of the men who had taken him away. "We force him to come to us, alone, without backup." Clara studied her son's face in the flickering light of their campfire, seeing in his features the ghost of the man who had been his father. The same determination, the same willingness to face danger head-on when someone he loved was threatened. It was a quality that had gotten his father killed, but it was also what had made her fall in love with him in the first place. "How do you propose we do that?" she asked. Thomas smiled, and for the first time since they had found each other, Clara saw genuine happiness in his expression. "We use the one thing Morrison wants more than anything else, evidence that could destroy him completely. We let him know we have it and we arrange a trade." "A trade for what?" "The truth," Thomas replied. "All of it. The names of everyone involved, the location of any remaining evidence, and most importantly, the identity of the man who ordered it all." Clara felt a mixture of pride and fear as she looked at her son. He had grown from a confused young man into someone capable of planning and executing a dangerous gambit. But she also knew that men like Morrison didn't honor bargains, especially when their lives and freedom hung in the balance. And if he tries to kill us instead of negotiating... Thomas's smile turned cold, and Clara saw something in his eyes that she recognized from her own mirror. The look of someone who had lost too much to back down now. Then we make sure we kill him first. The transformation of her gentle son into someone capable of calculated violence should have disturbed her. Instead, Clara felt a savage satisfaction. The men who had stolen him had shaped him into a weapon that could be turned against them, and justice had a certain poetic symmetry to it. The forged death certificate lay spread across Clara's makeshift table, its official seals and careful penmanship testament to a deception that had endured for 30 years. But it wasn't the document itself that had shaken Thomas to his core. It was the signature at the bottom, written in a hand he recognized from years of correspondence about his adoption and care. Morrison didn't just process this, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. He created it. Look at the date. It was signed the same day they took me, before they could possibly have known whether I had actually died. Clara studied the signature more carefully, noting the confident flourishes that suggested someone accustomed to signing official documents. But there was something else, a secondary signature that she had initially overlooked. The document had been witnessed and notarized by someone else, someone whose authority gave it legal weight beyond Morrison's local jurisdiction. Territorial Judge William Hastings, she read aloud, her blood turning cold as the implications became clear. He wasn't just aware of what was happening, he was actively participating in it. Thomas felt the world shift around him as pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Judge Hastings had been the legal guardian of his estate during his minority, managing the inheritance that should have come to him from his supposed adoptive parents. More importantly, Hastings had been the one to arrange his placement with the Hendersons, presenting himself as a family friend concerned for an orphaned child's welfare. He's been controlling my life from the very beginning, Thomas said, his voice rising with mounting anger. Every decision, every opportunity, every limitation, they all came through him. When I wanted to leave the Henderson farm, he convinced them to let me go. When I needed work, he arranged for me to come to Millhaven. Thomas stopped, his face going pale as another realization struck him. What is it? Clara asked, seeing the horror dawning in her son's eyes. The auction, Thomas whispered. I wasn't supposed to be there. Judge Hastings had arranged for me to be out of town that day, delivering papers to Cedar Falls. But the job was cancelled at the last minute, and I came back early. He looked at Clara with growing understanding. If I had been gone, you never would have found me. The auction would have proceeded, some other young man would have been sold, and I would have disappeared forever. Clara felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. He knew you would eventually remember, she said slowly. Children who are taken young sometimes recover their memories as adults. He needed you gone before that could happen. But he also needed to maintain the fiction that you had died as an infant, so he arranged to have me killed in a way that would look like an accident or random violence, Thomas concluded grimly. After 30 years of controlling my life, he was finally ready to end it. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. Clara immediately moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters to see Sheriff Morrison riding hard toward their hideout. But he wasn't alone. 3 other riders followed behind him, all wearing the badges and uniforms of territorial marshals. Federal backup, Clara said tersely, checking her rifle and calculating their options. Morrison must have convinced his superiors that we're dangerous fugitives. Thomas joined her at the window, studying the approaching lawman with the tactical awareness he had learned from years of frontier living. 4 men, well armed, with official authority to arrest or kill us on sight. And we're trapped in a building with limited exits and no cover outside. Not trapped, Clara corrected, moving toward the concealed entrance to the cellar they had discovered. Hidden, let them search an empty building while we listen from below. Sometimes the best strategy is to let your enemies reveal their intentions while they think you can't hear them. They descended into the hidden cellar just as Morrison and his men reached the homestead. From below, they could hear boots on the wooden floor above, accompanied by the sounds of a thorough search. Furniture was overturned, floorboards were tested, and walls were examined for hidden compartments. "Nothing here," one of the marshals reported. But someone's been living here recently. Fire's still warm, and there's fresh supplies." "They'll be back," Morrison replied. "Clara Rowe's not the type to abandon her camp permanently. We'll wait for them." "What about the boy?" another voice asked. Judge Hastings was very specific about what needed to happen to him. Clara felt Thomas stiffen beside her as Morrison's laugh filled the space above their heads. "Thomas McCarthy will disappear tonight, just like he was supposed to 30 years ago. Only this time, there won't be any witnesses left to tell stories about stolen children and forged documents." "And the woman?" "Killed while resisting arrest," Morrison said matter-of-factly. "She's wanted for multiple murders, after all. 4 good men dead since she came to town. And nobody will question us using necessary force to stop her." The conversation continued for another hour as the marshals made themselves comfortable in Clara's former camp, discussing details of their plan with the casual indifference of men accustomed to violence. They would wait until dark, then hunt Clara and Thomas through the desert with the systematic thoroughness of professional killers. But it was Morrison's final revelation that shook both Clara and Thomas to their cause. "Judge, Hastings wants this finished tonight because he's received word from Washington," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly through the floorboards. "There's going to be a federal investigation into territorial adoption practices. Too many questions are being asked about missing children and falsified records. We need to eliminate any living witnesses before the investigators arrive." "What about the other families? The ones who adopted stolen children?" "They'll be relocated," Morrison replied. "New identities, new locations, federal protection in exchange for their silence. But Clara Rowe and her son represent too great a risk. They have evidence, they have memories, and they have the legal standing to challenge everything we've built here." Clara and Thomas remained hidden in the cellar long after the marshals had settled in for their wait, both of them struggling to process the full scope of the conspiracy they had uncovered. This wasn't just about one stolen child or even one corrupt town. It was a territorial-wide operation that had been stealing and selling children for decades, with federal protection and judicial oversight. "How many families have been destroyed?" Thomas whispered, his voice thick with horror. "How many children were stolen from their parents and sold to the highest bidder?" "Hundreds, probably," Clara replied grimly. "Maybe thousands. And it's still happening." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the boxes of evidence that surrounded them in the hidden cellar. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a determination that reminded Clara powerfully of his father. "We can't just save ourselves," he said. "We have to stop this completely. All of it." Clara looked at her son, really looked at him for the first time since they had been reunited, and saw not the confused young man she had first approached in the stables, but a man capable of taking on a corrupt system and winning. The realization filled her with both pride and terror. "That's exactly what we're going to do," she said. "But first we need to survive the night." The hidden will emerged from its oiled wrapping like a resurrection, its carefully preserved parchment containing words that would reshape everything Clara and Thomas thought they understood about their situation. Clara's husband hadn't just been a simple rancher. He had been a territorial surveyor with detailed knowledge of mineral deposits and water rights throughout the region. The document revealed that their original homestead sat atop one of the largest silver veins ever discovered in the territory. "This changes everything," Thomas said, his hands trembling as he read the legal language that established him as the heir to a fortune that would have made him one of the wealthiest men in the territory. "They didn't just steal me to break up a family. They stole me to steal a fortune." Clara studied the will more carefully, noting the witness signatures and legal seals that proved its authenticity. Her husband had hidden this document for safekeeping, probably sensing that knowledge of the silver deposit would make their family a target. But his precautions hadn't been enough to protect them from men willing to commit murder and kidnapping for financial gain. Judge Hastings knew about this, she said grimly. He had to. As territorial judge, he would have had access to all surveyor reports and mineral claims. When your father died in that hunting accident, that wasn't an accident, was it? Thomas interrupted, seeing the truth in his mother's expression. Clara shook her head slowly. I always suspected, but I could never prove it. He was an experienced woodsman who knew the mountains better than anyone. The idea that he would carelessly discharge his own rifle. She paused, studying her son's face in the flickering candlelight. 3 days after he died, Judge Hastings came to our house with papers to sign. Said it was just legal formalities related to settling the estate. I was so grief-stricken, I signed whatever he put in front of me. Papers that transferred your property rights to the territorial government, Thomas concluded. Making it possible for them to claim the land was abandoned when they took me and declared you mentally unfit. Above their heads, the marshals were growing restless. Clara could hear them discussing patrol patterns and search strategies, their voices carrying the professional confidence of men who had hunted fugitives across difficult terrain. But there was something else in their conversation, an urgency that suggested they were working against a deadline. Judge wants this finished before dawn, Morrison was saying. The federal investigators are scheduled to arrive on the morning stage, and he needs to be able to present them with a simple story. Clara Rowe was a disturbed woman who killed 4 men in some delusional quest for revenge, and she died resisting arrest along with her unfortunate victim. What if they don't come back tonight? One of the marshals asked. What if they've already run? Morrison's laugh was harsh and confident. Clara Rowe's been hunting for her son for 30 years. She's not going to run now that she's found him. She'll come back, and when she does, we'll be ready for her. Clara felt a chill of recognition at how accurately Morrison had read her character. He was right. She wouldn't abandon Thomas, not after everything they had been through to find each other. But his certainty also revealed a weakness that might be exploited. Morrison expected them to behave predictably, to walk into his trap because maternal instinct would override tactical judgment. Thomas was examining the contents of another box, his expression growing more grim with each document he uncovered. These were records of other children who had been stolen over the years, complete with their original identities and the families who had purchased them. Some names Clara recognized from her travels, children who had supposedly died in various accidents and epidemics, but who had actually been sold to wealthy families in distant territories. Look at this, Thomas said, holding up a leather-bound ledger. They kept detailed financial records of every transaction. Purchase prices, transportation costs, bribes paid to officials. It's all here. Clara studied the ledger, her anger building as she saw the systematic nature of the operation. Children were classified by age, appearance, and supposed intelligence, with prices adjusted accordingly. Boys were generally worth more than girls, and children from families with property or inheritance were premium commodities. They were farming us, Thomas said, his voice thick with disgust. Like livestock. Taking children from families they could destroy and selling them to families they could trust to keep secrets. The sound of movement above indicated that the marshals were preparing to expand their search. Clara could hear them discussing the layout of the surrounding area, identifying likely hiding places and escape routes. They would begin their hunt systematically, using their superior numbers and local knowledge to corner their quarry. We need to get this evidence to someone who can act on it, Clara said, gathering the most damaging documents into a single bundle. Even if we don't survive, these records could save other families from what happened to us. Thomas looked up from the ledger he had been studying, his expression thoughtful. There might be another way, he said slowly. A way to end this completely and make sure the people responsible face justice. What are you thinking? Judge Hastings is expecting Morrison to report success by dawn. If we can intercept that report and substitute our own message. Thomas paused, organizing his thoughts. We could arrange a meeting with the judge under false pretenses. Make him think we're dead, and Morrison wants to discuss cleaning up loose ends. Clara felt a surge of pride at her son's tactical thinking, but also a stab of fear at the dangerous gambit he was proposing. That would require us to overpower 4 armed marshals without raising an alarm, forge Morrison's handwriting convincingly enough to fool a judge, and then confront a man who has federal protection and unlimited resources. Or, Thomas said with a grim smile, we could make Morrison write the message himself. The plan that emerged from their whispered conversation was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. They would wait for the marshals to begin their hunt, then use their knowledge of the hidden cellar to ambush them individually. Morrison would be taken alive and forced to write a message, summoning Judge Hastings to a private meeting. The judge would come, expecting to celebrate the elimination of the last threats to his criminal empire, but instead would find himself facing the very people he had tried to destroy. "If this goes wrong," Clara began. "If this goes wrong, we die," Thomas interrupted. "But we were going to die anyway. At least this way, we have a chance to take the people responsible with us." Clara reached into her coat and pulled out her father's rifle, a weapon that had served 3 generations of her family in moments of desperate need. The carved stock was worn smooth by decades of handling, and the barrel bore the scars of countless encounters with men who had underestimated the resolve of those who wielded it. "This rifle has never failed me," she said quietly, checking the action with practiced ease. "It killed the men who murdered my father, protected our family through 2 Indian wars, and put food on our table when times were hard. Tonight, it's going to help us get justice for 30 years of lies." Thomas examined his own weapons, Colt revolver he had carried since leaving the Henderson farm, and a hunting knife with a blade he kept razor sharp. Neither weapon had ever been used against another human being, but as he held them now, he felt a cold certainty that tonight would change that. The first marshal left the homestead at midnight, beginning a systematic search of the surrounding area. Clara and Thomas waited in the darkness of the cellar as his footsteps passed overhead, then faded into the night. When he was far enough away that his cries wouldn't alert his companions, Thomas emerged from the hidden entrance and followed him into the desert. The marshal never saw him coming. Years of stable work had made Thomas quick and quiet on his feet, and the darkness provided perfect concealment for someone who knew the terrain. When the marshal paused to light a cigarette, Thomas struck from behind with the butt of his revolver, dropping the man unconscious into the sagebrush. 1 down, 3 to go. The second marshal was more cautious, but also more predictable. He followed a patrol route that brought him past the old well every 20 minutes, and on his 3rd circuit, Clara was waiting for him. The crack of her rifle butt against his skull echoed briefly in the night air, before silence returned to the abandoned homestead. Morrison was becoming suspicious by the time his second man failed to report in. Clara could hear him calling their names, his voice carrying clearly across the desert stillness. When no answers came, he began cursing with the creativity of a man who realized his tactical advantage was rapidly disappearing. "Jameson! Mitchell! Where the hell are you?" Morrison's voice was tight with growing anger and fear. "If you two are playing games," the remaining marshal, a young man who looked barely old enough to shave, was visibly nervous as he huddled near the campfire they had built inside the homestead. "Maybe they found something," he suggested hopefully. "Maybe they're tracking the fugitives and can't respond." Morrison's snort of disgust made his opinion of that possibility clear. "Or maybe we're dealing with someone who's been hunting men a lot longer than we have." He drew his revolver and checked the cylinder with practiced efficiency. "Jenkins, you stay here and keep watch. I'm going to find our missing men and figure out what the hell is happening." Clara and Thomas had anticipated this moment. Morrison would be the most dangerous of their opponents, experienced, well-armed, and fighting for his life as well as his freedom. But he would also be alone, separated from his backup and operating in terrain they knew better than he did. They let him search for an hour, following him from a distance as he discovered the unconscious bodies of his men and realized the true nature of the trap he had walked into. When he finally stopped in a small clearing surrounded by cottonwood trees, Clara stepped out of concealment with her rifle trained on his chest. "Sheriff Morrison," she said conversationally, her voice carrying clearly across the 20 yards that separated them. "We need to have a conversation." Morrison spun toward her voice, his own weapon coming up with the speed of long practice. But Thomas was already behind him, the barrel of his Colt pressed against the base of Morrison's skull. "I wouldn't," Thomas said quietly. "I've been wanting to kill you for 30 years. Don't give me an excuse." Morrison slowly lowered his weapon, his face twisted with a mixture of rage and grudging respect. "Clever," he admitted. "I underestimated you both. Most people do," Clara replied, moving closer while keeping her rifle aimed at his center mass. "Now you're going to write a message to Judge Hastings. You're going to tell him that Clara Rowe and Thomas McCarthy are dead, and that you need to meet with him immediately to discuss disposing of the evidence and coordinating with the federal investigators. And if I refuse—" Thomas pressed the gun barrel harder against Morrison's neck. "Then you die right here and we find another way to get to the judge. But either way, this ends tonight." Morrison was quiet for a long moment, calculating odds and considering options. Finally, he nodded slowly. "You'll never get away with this. Even if you kill Hastings, there are others. This operation has federal backing that goes all the way to Washington. Then we'll deal with Washington when the time comes," Clara replied grimly. "Right now, we're focused on the men who stole my son and murdered my husband. Everything else can wait." As Morrison began writing the message that would lure Judge Hastings to his final reckoning, Clara felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. They had come this far, through careful planning and desperate courage, but the most dangerous part of their mission still lay ahead. Hastings was no simple frontier criminal. He was a man with resources, connections, and decades of experience in manipulating legal systems to his advantage. But as she watched her son standing over the man who had cut him with a knife 30 years ago, Clara felt a fierce pride in what they had accomplished together. Tomorrow might bring its own challenges, but tonight they were no longer victims. Tonight they were hunters stalking the men who had destroyed their family. The transformation was complete. Judge William Hastings arrived at the abandoned homestead just before dawn, his black carriage drawn by matching horses and accompanied by 2 armed guards who clearly expected nothing more dangerous than a routine meeting. Clara watched from the shadows as he stepped down from the carriage with the confidence of a man who believed he controlled every aspect of the situation unfolding around him. He was older than Clara had expected, his silver hair and lined face suggesting a man well into his 60s. But there was nothing frail about his bearing or the sharp intelligence in his eyes as he surveyed the homestead where he believed his problems had finally been solved. "Morrison," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "I received your message. Where are the bodies?" Clara's father's rifle felt steady in her hands as she stepped out of concealment, the weapon's familiar weight providing comfort in the tense moments before violence erupted. Thomas moved simultaneously from his position behind the carriage, his revolver trained on the guards before they could react to this unexpected development. "Judge Hastings," Clara said conversationally, her voice cutting through the morning's stillness like a blade. "We've been looking forward to meeting you." The judge's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, and finally a cold calculation that suggested he was already planning how to turn this situation to his advantage. His guards were reaching for their weapons, but Thomas's sharp command stopped them. "Don't," he said clearly, his aim unwavering despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I'm very good with this gun, and I have 30 years of anger to work through." Hastings raised his hands slowly, but his eyes remained alert and dangerous. "Clara Rowe," he said, as if testing the name on his tongue. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience over the years. I was told you were dead. A lot of people were told a lot of things, Clara replied, moving closer while keeping her rifle trained on his chest. Most of them lies, like the lie you told about my son dying of fever, like the lie you told about my husband's hunting accident, like the lie you've been living for 30 years. I've no idea what you're talking about, Hastings said smoothly, but his eyes flickered toward his guards in a way that suggested he was calculating the odds of fighting his way out of this confrontation. Thomas stepped into his line of sight, and Clara saw recognition dawn in the judge's face, not of who Thomas was now, but of who he had once been. The baby who had been stolen from his mother's arms had grown into a man capable of seeking justice, and Hastings was seeing the failure of his careful plans written in Thomas's determined expression. Michael Rowe, Hastings said quietly, using the name Thomas had been born with. You've grown up. No thanks to you, Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. But I remember now. I remember the night you had me stolen from my mother. I remember Sheriff Morrison cutting me with a knife to make me let go of her dress. And I remember your voice giving the orders. Hastings' composure cracked slightly, revealing the cold intelligence beneath his judicial facade. You remember what a traumatized child thinks he remembers, he said dismissively. No court would accept such testimony. Clara pulled out the bundle of documents they had recovered from the hidden cellar. The ledgers, the falsified records, the evidence of systematic child trafficking that stretched back decades. What about this testimony? She asked, letting the papers spill onto the ground between them. 30 years of evidence documenting every child you stole, every family you destroyed, every dollar you made from selling human beings. For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Hastings' face as he recognized the documents. He had thought them safely hidden, buried so deep that they would never surface to threaten his carefully constructed empire. Where did you find those? He demanded, his voice losing its smooth authority. In the cellar of your dead partner's homestead, Thomas replied. Turns out, Morrison kept very detailed records, including financial statements showing exactly how much you were paid for arranging my adoption and transferring my inheritance to your control. One of Hastings' guards was slowly reaching for a concealed weapon, his movement almost imperceptible in the grey light of dawn. But Clara had been watching for exactly such an attempt, and her father's rifle spoke with the authority of 3 generations of frontier justice. The guard spun and fell, his weapon flying from nerveless fingers to land in the dust. The sound of the rifle shot echoed across the desert, bringing an abrupt end to any pretense of civilized negotiation. Thomas's revolver was already swinging toward the second guard, who raised his hands quickly to show he wanted no part of a gunfight against desperate people with nothing left to lose. Now then, Clara said calmly, working the rifle's action to chamber another round. Let's discuss the terms of your surrender. Thomas's original birth certificate lay spread across the dusty ground between him and Judge Hastings, its official seals and careful penmanship providing irrefutable proof of his true identity. Unlike the forged death certificate that had erased Michael Rowe from existence, this document had been hidden away as insurance, waiting 30 years for the moment when it would restore a stolen life to its rightful owner, Michael Rowe, born March 15, 1842, to Clara and James Rowe of Pine Ridge Township, Thomas read aloud, his voice gaining strength with each word. Heir to all properties, mineral rights, and assets of the Rowe family estate. He looked up at Hastings, his eyes blazing with the fury of a man reclaiming his stolen birthright. That's me, isn't it? That's who I was, before you decided I would be more valuable as someone else. Hastings had regained some of his composure, falling back on decades of legal training and political maneuvering. Even if what you claim is true, he said carefully, the statute of limitations on any crimes would have expired. Clara interrupted, her voice cutting through his lawyer's double talk like a blade. Murder has no statute of limitations. Neither does kidnapping. Neither does fraud on the scale you've been operating. Thomas pulled out the hidden will that established him as heir to a silver fortune, holding it where Hastings could see the document that revealed the true scope of what had been stolen from him. "This is why you had my father killed, isn't it? He discovered the silver deposits on our land and filed the proper claims. You couldn't just steal the property. You needed to eliminate the entire family to make your theft legal. Your father was a fool," Hastings said, his mask of judicial dignity finally slipping to reveal the cold ambition beneath. "He could have been part of this operation. I offered him partnership, a share of the profits from developing the silver deposits. Instead, he threatened to expose everything unless the stolen children were returned to their families." Clara felt the pieces of her husband's death finally falling into place. James hadn't died in a hunting accident. He had been murdered for trying to save other families from the tragedy that would soon destroy his own. "So, you had him killed," she said, her finger tightening on her rifle's trigger. "And then you came for my son." "I took the boy to protect him," Hastings replied, his voice carrying the righteous tone of someone who had convinced himself that his crimes were acts of mercy. "A woman alone, with no resources or connections, what kind of life could you have given him?" Thomas stepped forward, his revolver steady in his hand, despite the rage coursing through his system. "The kind of life where he would have known his mother's love, where he would have grown up knowing his real name, his real history, his real family." His voice rose with each word, 30 years of suppressed pain and anger finally finding expression. "You stole that from both of us. I gave you a better life than you ever would have had with her," Hastings snapped, his composure cracking under the weight of his guilt and fear. "The Hendersons raised you as a good Christian boy. They taught you values, discipline, respect for authority. They taught me to accept lies," Thomas countered. "They taught me to be grateful for crumbs from the table of men who had stolen everything that should have been mine." Clara could see the federal investigators approaching in the distance, their official carriage moving steadily toward the homestead, where this 30-year conspiracy was finally being exposed. But she also knew that men like Hastings had resources that extended far beyond local law enforcement. "The investigators won't help you," Hastings said, following her gaze. "I've been preparing for their arrival for weeks. They'll find evidence of Clara Rowe's criminal conspiracy, documents proving she was an unfit mother whose delusions led her to murder innocent men. By the time I'm finished with my testimony, you'll be remembered as a mad woman who destroyed a peaceful community." "Will we?" Thomas asked, pulling out Sheriff Morrison's signed confession, the statement they had forced him to write before dawn, detailing his role in the conspiracy and naming Hastings as the mastermind. "Or will they be more interested in this?" Hastings stared at the document, his face going pale as he recognized Morrison's handwriting and official seal. "Morrison would never—" "Morrison is dead," Clara said simply, the words carrying the finality of justice delivered. "So are the marshals you brought to eliminate us. So is everyone else who knew the truth about what you did to my family." For the first time, Hastings looked genuinely afraid. The network of corruption and intimidation he had spent decades building was collapsing around him, and he was facing the prospect of answering for his crimes without the protection of his co-conspirators. Thomas raised his revolver, the weapon steady in his grip as he prepared to deliver the justice that had been 30 years in coming. "This is for my father, who died trying to protect other families from what you did to us. This is for my mother, who spent 30 years searching for a son she never stopped loving. And this is for me, for the childhood you stole, the inheritance you claimed, and the truth you tried to bury." The new family photograph sat on the mantelpiece of the rebuilt Rowe homestead, showing Clara and Thomas together for the first time in 30 years. The silver frame caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that looked out over land that had finally been returned to its rightful owners. Both faces showed the marks of their long journey, lines earned through suffering and struggle, but also the peace that came from justice finally served and family finally restored. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the abandoned homestead. 6 months since federal investigators had arrived to find Judge Hastings in custody, and a mountain of evidence documenting one of the largest child trafficking operations in territorial history. The investigation had spread far beyond Millhaven, reaching into the highest levels of territorial and federal government. Dozens of officials had been arrested, hundreds of families had been reunited, and the systematic theft of children from vulnerable parents had finally been brought to an end. Thomas, who had legally reclaimed his birth name of Michael Rowe, but continued to answer to either, stood at the window of the home his father had built, watching workers extract silver ore from the mine that had cost his family so much. The wealth that flowed from the earth was beyond anything he had imagined during his years as a stable hand. But it felt less important now than the simple fact that he was standing in the house where he should have grown up. "The territorial governor wants to meet with you again," Clara said, entering the room with a stack of correspondence that had arrived on the morning stage. "Something about an appointment to the Territorial Judicial Council. He says they need honest men to rebuild the legal system." Thomas smiled, an expression that came more easily to him now that the weight of 30 years of lies had been lifted from his shoulders. "I think I'll stick to mining for a while. Politics seems like a dangerous profession for men with inconvenient memories." Clara laughed, a sound that still surprised her with its lightness after decades of carrying grief and anger. "Your father would have said the same thing. He never trusted officials who smiled too much or made too many promises." The investigation had revealed the full scope of what they had uncovered that terrible dawn when Judge Hastings had met his final accounting. Over 200 children had been stolen from their families over the course of 3 decades, sold to wealthy families who paid premium prices for healthy children with good bloodlines. The operation had generated millions of dollars in profits, most of which had been invested in legitimate businesses and political campaigns that gave the conspirators increasing power and protection. Thomas had testified before 3 separate federal commissions, his recovered memories providing crucial evidence about how the operation had functioned. The process had been emotionally exhausting, forcing him to relive traumatic experiences that his mind had spent years trying to forget. But it had also been healing, allowing him to finally understand the full truth of what had happened to him and why. "Martha Henley stopped by while you were in town," Clara said, settling into the chair beside the fireplace where she did her evening reading. "She wanted to thank you again for not pressing charges against her. Said she's been sleeping better since she told the investigators everything she knew." Thomas nodded. Martha had been one of the minor players in the conspiracy, guilty primarily of keeping silent about crimes she had witnessed rather than actively participating in them. Her testimony had been valuable in understanding how the operation had functioned, but her remorse seemed genuine. Unlike Judge Hastings and Sheriff Morrison, she had been a reluctant participant who had been coerced into compliance rather than motivated by greed. "Any word from Dr. Patterson?" Thomas asked, referring to the federal physician who had been helping other recovered victims deal with their psychological trauma. "He says there are at least 50 families in similar situations to ours, children who have recovered memories of their true identities, and parents who never stopped searching for them." Clara's voice carried a mixture of sadness and hope. "It's going to take years to sort out all the legal complications, but at least the healing can begin." The sun was setting over the valley that stretched out below their rebuilt homestead, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded Clara of the evening she had first arrived in Millhaven with nothing but determination and a desperate hope. So much had changed since then, but the most important change was sitting across from her, reading a book in the lamplight and occasionally humming the lullaby she had sung to him as an infant. "Do you ever regret it?" Thomas asked suddenly, looking up from his reading. "Everything we went through to get to this point? All the violence and danger and pain?" Clara considered the question carefully, her eyes moving to the photograph that documented their reunion. "I regret that it took 30 years, she said finally. "I regret that your father didn't live to see you become the man he hoped you would be." I regret that we lost so much time that can never be recovered." She paused, meeting his gaze directly. "But I don't regret fighting for you. I don't regret refusing to accept the lies they told about your death. And I don't regret making sure that the people who stole you face justice for what they did." Thomas smiled and returned to his reading. But Clara could see the peace in his expression, the contentment of a man who finally knew where he belonged and who he really was. Outside their windows, the silver mine operated around the clock, extracting wealth from the earth that would ensure the Rowe family never again faced the vulnerability that had made them targets for men like Judge Hastings. But the real treasure wasn't the silver that came from the ground. It was the simple fact that a mother and son, who had been separated by lies and violence, were finally home together, sharing the quiet evening hours that had been stolen from them, but could never be stolen again. The photograph on the mantelpiece caught the flickering light from the fireplace, showing two faces that bore the marks of their journey, but also the promise of the future they would build together. It was a new beginning, hard-won and precious beyond measure.